So next we're going to hear from Debbie Salam, some really timely and exciting stuff on the Form W-4 considerations. So Debbie, are you ready?
I am, and thanks, Christy. And I want to say that it was perfect timing. This morning, about an hour before we were set to get ready to go live here, the IRS issued the final 2020 Form W-4. So if you guys are wondering why our slides were a little bit delayed, popping up on the screen, that's why. We did update the deck to show the latest development from this morning. There were just minor changes made to the final 2020 Form W-4, mostly in Part 2 around privacy. But let's talk about what's happening here. So under the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, as you all remember, effective January 1, 2018 through 2025, personal allowances are no longer allowed, and as well as a number of miscellaneous deductions were taken away. And this necessarily meant that the IRS needed to modify the Form W-4 and the income tax withholding calculations. Congress envisioned that and gave Congress a year to get that done. In 2019, which is when Congress wanted IRS to get it done, a lot of the stuff that we're seeing now was proposed by the IRS, and businesses and software providers basically gave the feedback that there was insufficient time to incorporate those kind of significant changes before the end of the year. So the IRS announced that it would delay it to 2020. So here we are, it's 2020, and now the IRS is basically updating the Form W-4 and the income tax withholding requirements. And the point that I want to make here is the delay was already given. It was delayed from 2019 to 2020. So I have a lot of clients asking me, is the IRS going to give us a grace period after January 1 to incorporate these changes? And the answer is no, because there was already that 1-year grace period. So today, the IRS released the final Form W-4 for 2020. It does include many changes compared to prior years, and the most significant is that on the 2020 Form W-4, you won't be seeing any personal allowances anymore. Along with the new 2020 Form W-4, the IRS also created a new publication called Publication 15T. And this publication shows the new withholding tables and the instructions for doing income tax withholding as it relates to the new Form W-4. The second draft that was issued, I believe in August, actually included all of the changes that the IRS intended to make, except for updating the numbers, the inflation adjustments for 2020. So that at least gave employers an ability to do some testing to see if things work using the old 2019 numbers. Publication 15T, the IRS announced today, that publication will be available in mid-December, and I would expect the older Publication 15 will also roll out at about the same time. So middle of November is when we'll have everything. Now, one question that has come in a lot and the IRS addressed in a recent payroll industry call is what about the lock-in letter? And as you know, the lock-in letter basically trumps the Form W-4, okay? So this is somebody who didn't have enough withholding on their tax return, and the IRS wants to decrease whatever they're doing in their W-4. They want it to make sure that they're getting more income tax withheld. Unfortunately, the lock-in letter has not yet been updated to accommodate the new Form W-4, in particular, no personal allowances, okay? The IRS has not really provided a date when they're going to be updating their guidance and revising those processes. So on that, we're just going to have to wait a little bit more time. Okay, so how does the old W-4 and the new W-4 compare? And what I'm going to be doing in the next several minutes is doing that comparison. And why is this important? In order to, the IRS gives you two ways to deal with the change. You can keep all of your old W-4s prior to 2020 in a separate system and then use only one of the tables that the IRS provides in Publication 15T, and then process those payrolls separately. or you can combine all the W-4s and do everything under one system. But in order to do that, you would actually have to translate the information from the old W-4s into the new W-4 format. And that's what we're going to be talking about here briefly for a few minutes. On the old W-4, in the first section, you'd have people claiming single, married but withholded as higher single rate. That is now changed. The language is different. It's single or married filing separately, married filing jointly, or qualifying widows, and then head of household. So if you're translating, in other words, you want to take an old W-4 and put it into the new W-4 system, because remember, you can't require your employee to complete a 2020 Form W-4. Your translation, for instance, if an employee says married but withhold at a higher single rate, you would make that to be single or married filing jointly, because that would be the translation into the new W-4 system. Then we get to the next section where the employee is claiming total number of allowances that you're claiming from the applicable worksheet. And that has been replaced with Step 2 and Step 3. Step 2 is a checkbox to indicate if you have multiple jobs or you're married filing jointly and you have a spouse that works. And then Step 3 is where you can claim the exemption for dependents. So if you have an older W-4 from prior to 2020, you would treat Step 2 and Step 3 as blank. Okay? All right. So what about additional amount, if any, the employee wants withheld from their paycheck? That amount would carry over to the new W-4 template because there is a section in Step 4 where the employee can ask for additional tax they want withheld. So you would move the amount from the 2019 Form W-4 to Step 4 of the new Form W-4 template. Now, in Step 4, there's other additional fields where the employee can enter other income. This would be maybe equity income or investments and stuff where they aren't going to have income tax withheld. They can add that so that they get additional withholding. And then also in Step 4, they can show deductions, which of course would reduce their withholding. So obviously if you don't have a 2020 Form W-4, those sections would be treated as blank. Okay, what about Step 7 from the old W-4? On Step 7, this is where the employee can claim exempt from federal income tax withholding. Unfortunately, on the new W-4, there is no place to claim exempt from withholding. And there were many comments that were given to the IRS about, putting a specific checkbox back for that, and the IRS indicated that it did not intend to do that. So now, if an employee wants to claim exempt from withholding, they're instructed to write exempt on the Form W-4 in the space below Step 4C, and that's how they would have no income tax withheld. So this is still an item that you'll be able to transfer from the old W-4s to the new W-4 template. Now, the IRS also says that an electronic system can add a checkbox for claiming exempt, provided that the checkbox also includes the language from Publication 15T about the conditions around claiming exemption from withholding. Okay, so let's look at a little bit of a procedural guidance from the IRS. First, the IRS does emphasize that for employees who furnished Forms W-4 before 2020 and who do not furnish a new one after 2019, you have to continue to withhold based on the form previously submitted. You are also not permitted to treat an employee as failing to furnish a Form W-4 if they don't give you a 2020 Form W-4. However, if the employee claimed exempt from federal income tax withholding in 2019, then they are going to have to give you a 2020 Form W-4 if they want to claim that exemption again. Because remember, if you claim exemption from withholding on the W-4, that W-4 expires, so a new Form W-4 for the year is required. The same withholding tables will be used for the Forms W-4s issued before 2020 and Forms W-4 issued in 2020 and later years. And as I previously mentioned, you can either take the old W-4s and translate them to the new W-4 format and handle all of your payroll processing in one location, or you can keep your old W-4s separate, apply the standard table to those W-4s, run those checks, and then run the other checks for 2020 and later. I think that's a more complicated way of doing it, but the IRS does give you that option. Okay, and as I mentioned previously, if you do use a single system to process payroll withholding for all of the W-4s, new and old, you are going to have to translate the old W-4s into the new W-4 format. So hopefully you've already done that and you've tested it and you've made sure that the translation process worked properly. Okay, what about the non-resident employees? As you recall, a non-resident alien, there is an amount that has to be added to their wages. This takes into account the fact that they're not eligible for the standard deduction, so a certain amount has to be added back to get their withholding correct. Okay, and so the IRS now has two tables to do that. There's a Table 1, that's for employees who have an older W-4, and then Table 2 is for employees with W-4s from 2020 or later years. So let's look at an example of what we're talking about. Let's say an employee, the last time they gave you a W-4 was in 2018, and they claim married with two allowances, and they don't give you a Form W-4 after January 1 of 2020. You would use only the standard withholding rate schedules table. So in the 2020 tables now, there are two tables. One says standard, and the other one says Form W-2 step due checkbox. So the only time you use the Form W-2 step due checkbox table is if that section of the W-4 was completed. And obviously, the step 2 checkbox will only appear on a 2020 or later Form W-4. Okay, I want to move on now to talk about the state implications because this is probably the bigger story. I mean, once you get past the hurdle of these significant changes at the federal level, I think this will be the next challenge for employers. And many are already reaching out to us, already asking for research and information. We are doing a perpetual ongoing survey of the states. But there's going to be an issue, and clearly that issue rests where a state is continuing to allow use of the federal Form W-4, but state allowances are still used in the state income tax withholding calculation. That's going to be a problem, right? Because if your employee completes the 2020 Form W-4 and you're not allowed to have any personal allowances on it, but you can have personal allowances at the state level, you could be over withheld for state income tax. So where do we stack up? If you look at our heat map, you'll see we did some pretty detailed research here. If you look at the states, obviously in gray, there's no state income tax, hurrah, we don't have to worry about them. If you look at the states that are in solid yellow, these states do not have a state-specific form, okay? They're using the Form W-4 for calculating state income tax. Utah addressed its issue by passing legislation. So what Utah did to address the problem is to say, well, in Utah, we're not going to allow for standard allowances either. Personal allowances. So using the federal Form W-4 will be fine because there's really no difference in what we're doing. But look at the rest of the yellow states, if you would, the yellow diagonals, and look for all of them that have a reddish star. If they have a reddish star, they have personal allowances in the income tax withholding calculation. So if they only use the federal Form W-4 and there's personal allowances in the income tax withholding calculation, these states really need to move immediately to either create a state form or change their tax law like Utah did. And this has still not happened. So the question is, when is it going to happen? And what are you going to do as we move into January of 2020? So as I said, we are beginning to conduct telephone surveys with these states that are problematic, and for our clients who subscribe, we're reporting to them what's happening. Okay, we have another issue. If you look at the states, the other states that are, I think, in green on this chart, and look for those that have a yellow dot, that means that there is a state form, okay, but they also allow for the federal Form W-4. And if there is a star, it means also that there are state withholding allowances allowed. So in these states where there is a state form and they allow the federal form and there are personal allowances, in these states you want to encourage your employees to fill out a separate state form W-4 to avoid over-withholding of state income tax, okay? Because using the federal form is going to cut off their personal allowances at the state level. So again, you can't make employees do that, but you definitely want to send out a communication. Now, in the other states that have their own state-specific form, we have no issue. So these states have already addressed the problem by creating a state-specific form and basically decoupling from the federal form W-4. And we've had a lot of developments in that area. Idaho, Montana, Oklahoma, Oregon, they all created their own specific forms in 2019. Nebraska is doing one effective in 2020. And then Wisconsin came out and clearly stated in effective, any new employees or anybody making changes, they're no longer going to accept the federal form W-4. So again, we're seeing a very slow progress in addressing the state withholding issue, and you will absolutely have some issues in some states until they get it resolved. And I expect this will be an issue that will be ongoing all of next year. So how have businesses been addressing this challenge? And I'm just going to go through here some leading practices. November through December, you should have already been doing system testing using the draft data of Publication 15T and inputting some mock W-4 data using the 2020 fields and testing to make sure that you've done your conversions of your W-4 data properly, that your income tax withholding calculations are working, and then you maybe want to test some state income tax withholding, again using mock data. So a lot of businesses have been through this process just using the sample data from the publications. Sometime in December, you do want to be sure that you are notifying all your employees of the new 2020 Form W-4. A lot of businesses might be considering the help of a third party to help them develop webcasts, videos, an employee portal, giving them information to help explain it because the IRS information may not be enough. And I know Tom's going to be talking about this a little bit more too. And then, of course, now that we have the final Form W-4, when that final publication 15T comes out, you can start collecting some actual employee Form W-2s. Form W-4s. You do already have the payroll system tables for 2020. They're final, so you do have that information. So as soon as you start getting a few employee 2020 Forms W-4, you need to do another test again using real data. And that, of course, needs to happen before the end of the year. And then finally, from December to April, you definitely want to be looking at employee support. You want to consider a call center, maybe operated by a third-party tax professional, to respond to Form W-4 questions and so forth. And hopefully you've already thought about all of that and how you're going to approach that in terms of employee support. So that's the big word on the employer considerations. Tom, I know, is now going to be picking up the employee issues. Before we go there, Christy, would you tell us the results of that last polling question?
Sure thing, Debbie. Thank you. That was really informative from an employer standpoint and certainly fresh off the presses. It looks like almost 50% of you, most of you had challenges with preparing for the 2020 Form W-4. And then secondly, tracking compliance with state and local pay rules. So we do have this next polling question. Please be sure to respond. And with that, we will hear from Tom DiLorenzo on the employee considerations of the new 2020 Form W-4.
Thanks, Christy. Having just heard a lot of great information from Debbie from the employer's perspective on the W-4 changes, we're going to take a look at some considerations from the employee side now. Typically, whenever we see changes involving an employee's compensation or benefits, it normally gives rise to many questions. And when you add tax into the mix, it only adds to the level of anxiety that an employee might be experiencing. So over the next few slides, what we'll do is we'll take a look at some of the frequently asked questions an employee may have surrounding their W-4 and these changes. So for some, the changes to the W-4 may not sound like a call to action. After all, the employee has the option of whether or not to update the W-4 using the new form. However, there could be some adverse consequences of not updating the W-4. Namely, they could be paying too much or too little in tax throughout the year. So those that may be on a tight budget, which a lot of us are, they may find themselves in a difficult financial situation at tax filing time if they did not withhold enough in taxes during the year. And this could be further amplified if they haven't met the minimum withholding requirements to meet the safe harbor to avoid any underpayment tax penalties. The good news is the new W-4 should be more intuitive for some, with it no longer being based on choosing the number of allowances to take. And for those that have a simple tax situation, it should be a fairly simple process. In these cases, an employee really can simply complete step 1 of the W-4 and sign their name at the end. In this instance, withholding will be based on the standard deduction tied to their filing status and the tax rates applicable to their wages, without regard to any other income. So next, let's talk about how the updated W-4 will increase the accuracy of federal income tax withholding. The new Form W-4 is designed to increase the accuracy of federal income tax withholding. But for this more precise withholding to occur, they will need to complete additional steps on the form, particularly if their tax situation is not so simple. While step 1 of the form will simply determine their filing status, steps 2 through 4 will delve deeper into their tax situation to help determine their proper withholding. And I know Debbie touched on some of this earlier, but if we look at step 2, for instance, this is going to ask for information regarding a second job they may have. This step also explores whether their spouse has earned income. Such information like this can be quite helpful, as additional sources of income suggest that withholding should potentially be higher. The third step of the form asks about dependents, namely any children under the age of 17, which would allow for them to qualify for the child tax credit. The greater the child tax credit they qualify for, based on the number of qualifying children they have, the lower the tax withholding will likely be. And then step 4, the last step before signing their name, inquires about other income, deductions, and whether they want to request additional tax be withheld. Non-earned income from sources such as investments and IRA distributions will increase the amount of tax that needs to be withheld, so they're going to want to consider that as well. Completing step 4 of the W-4 can save employees from having to make quarterly estimated tax payments, which for many is a daunting and unfamiliar process. So many folks try to avoid that if possible. And for those who itemize their deductions, completing step 4 allows them to indicate the amount of the deductions that they have that will reduce their income, thereby, in turn, reducing their tax withholding. So now let's take a moment and talk about step 2 in a bit more detail, since this will likely be a scenario that comes up quite frequently, particularly for those that are in 2-income homes. So step 2, as you recall, this allows you to account for multiple jobs you may have, or if you have a spouse with income as well. So for those who wish to adjust their withholding in light of other earned income they have, step 2 does require some additional action that the employee is going to have to take. So there are 3 options for them to choose from. Option 1 is going to entail them using the tax withholding estimator that's available on the IRS website. They're going to use the results from this estimator to input onto their W-4. And I know going to the IRS website for many can seem very scary, but the IRS has really done a nice job in creating a very user-friendly tool, in my opinion, that will help determine what they need to input onto the form. When they go to the withholding estimator, at a minimum, they're going to want to have a copy of their and their spouse's, if married, most recent pay stub so that they can get the most accurate results from the calculator. Option 1 is going to be the most accurate of the 3 options that we're going to talk about for their withholding. Option 2, for those that just choose not to want to use that tax withholding estimator calculator, the W-4 form provides a worksheet to factor in the income from a second job or their spouse's job. Now, whether they use option 1 or option 2, the fact that they have a second source of income, in this case, will not be revealed to the employer if privacy and protecting their privacy is a concern for an employee. Option 3, however, not only informs the employer of a second job or a second source of income, but it's also going to be the least accurate of the 3 options. By simply checking a box on the form, the standard deduction and the tax brackets will be split evenly between the 2 jobs. The issue here is the assumption that their 2 jobs provide equal income is what makes this the least accurate option, because it's just splitting that deduction in half and splitting the brackets, which, in most cases, having equal income will likely not be the case. So now that we know, what the options are, next we'll talk a little bit about when the employee should make changes to their W-4. So in addition to updating their W-4 when the new form is released, or now that the new form is released, there are certain life events that should lead an employee to consider updating their W-4. For instance, this could be obtaining a second job or a spouse starting a new job. Could be realizing a large investment gain. All of these are reasons they may want to increase the amount of tax withholding that they have due to these changes in income. On the other hand, getting married, having a child, these could potentially be reasons for decreasing withholding. So that's another good opportunity to revisit their W-4. Or they could be in a situation where maybe they incur a large medical expense, they purchase a home, they make a donation to charity. These are events that may allow someone to switch from taking the standard deduction to itemizing. Or it could simply increase the amount of deductions they are already itemizing if they were doing so beforehand. So it's always going to be a good idea for employees to be revisiting the W-4, not only when the new form comes out, but throughout their time of employment. So when these changes occur, it'll be important for employees to know what resources they're going to have available to them. So the W-4 process in general has typically provided employees with a lot of uncertainty in the past, and was something that they may have avoided revisiting even when they had life changes. Now that these changes are occurring, there'll likely be many questions from employees on the new W-4. So it's going to be important to consider how these questions will be addressed and whether additional support will be needed to help employees navigate through this transition that they're going through. in the meantime, the IRS has made several resources available to learn more about this topic. Originally I was going to say that the draft version of the W-4 is available, but as Debbie and others mentioned, the final version has been released today and can now be viewed on the IRS website. There were some minor changes, but most of the W-4 is substantially the same as it was to the draft.
Hey, Tom?
There's also that, yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt. This is Debbie, but we just got a really great question that came in. And it is, there's a lot of employees, they don't want to show their private financial information on the W-4, so they can get additional withholding. What is their option if they don't want to share that private information on the W-4?
Right. So, as we were talking about earlier, if they don't want to share that information, finally using option 1 of the form, or where they're using the tax withholding estimator, is not going to provide any of that information to their employer. So that would be the option that would allow for them to protect their privacy, essentially, if they weren't wanting to disclose that information.
Right, or they could just, calculate what they need and just ask for additional withholding and leave it at that, right?
Sure, absolutely. They could do that as well.
Thank you.
Yep. So again, the resources are there to help them from the IRS. And that those, for the time being, will be where they could go if they're looking for additional information. You could click on any of the hyperlinks there to be taken to each one of those resources. But again, it'll be important, over the coming months to really look to see if they're going to have the support or the resources they need as they navigate through these changes that they're going to be faced with the W-4.
And Tom, another thing is I'm getting a lot of comments about employers being very concerned about getting too deep into helping employees with their W-4 questions because they don't want to be giving tax advice.
Sure. Are
you seeing that kind of concern out there with the clients you're working with, and how are they addressing that?
We are. So, as you said, typically, employers really aren't comfortable having detailed conversations about the W-4 or tax issues in general, which is understandable. Most of the conversations that they're having are focused on, that the employee has to file the form, but, it's up to the employee to really determine what changes they need to make. What we see a lot of clients doing, and what we've seen through a number of our financial wellness programs, is providing a resource for them to go to for questions like this. And updating the W-4 is a popular topic that we speak to many employees about through our financial wellness programs. So using third parties to get a lot of these issues addressed is something that we're seeing a number of clients do. And particularly they're providing services that range from call center support, as you mentioned, to group seminars, to digital resources, but we are seeing a lot of folks address it through financial wellness programs that they might be offering. All right, and with that, Christy, I think we have the results from our last polling question, or do you have those results?
I do, and it looks like most of the audience is somewhat confident that their employer will meet the new Form W-4 and income tax withholding requirements for 2020. And we also have our next polling question. So while folks are responding to our next polling question, I'm going to ask you, Debbie, a couple of questions here that have come in that I think we need to address. Does the 2020 Form W-4 affect only new hires? And then also, if an employee does not intend to change their withholding to the new Form W-4 in 2020, will there be a point in future tax years where they will be required to complete a whole new Form W-4? Debbie or Tom?
Good question. So who has to complete the 2020 Form W-4? Only your new hires, and only those employees that need to make a change to the W-4. And that does include anybody who claimed exemption from withholding. Another question we're getting, does the February 15th deadline still apply for an employee who claimed exempt? Yes, it does. So if they claimed exempt in 2019, by February 15th, they have to give you a 2020 Form W-4. So who does this affect? New hires, employees who claimed exempt, and anybody who wants to change their W-4 after January 1 of 2020. Will the IRS at some point require that all employees complete this new form? That's doubtful. Here's why. Remember, these are temporary tax provisions. They suspend or expire after 2025. So we may be going back to the old W-4. I don't see the IRS requiring that all employees complete